Hello, and welcome to the lesson planning workshop on secondary essay subjects. So this will mainly be looking at things in the lens of an essay subject where normally the topics are going on a bit longer, where there might be kind of a blend of assessment objectives across multiple topics, and generally it's going to be adapted for that kind of GCSE to A level kind of session. But obviously a lot of these skills are transferable, and hopefully they can be applicable for like primary level as well as more STEM subjects or more kind of quantitatively oriented subjects. Today we will be covering kind of 5 key points. Reading student profiles and how to effectively use a session 0, conducting your initial assessments, how to use learning cycles, and then 2 key tutor skills, synthesizing content with exam skills and adaptability. Okay, so we're now looking at reading a student profile firstly. So we are looking at a case study today. We have Morgan, who is starting in September. This is basically to give you an indication of what a student profile looks like. Hopefully, if you've by now working with us, you might have tutees already, or if you've at least seen on Tutor Cruncher the way the Greenhouse kind of builds a student profile. Normally it has information about their needs, kind of specific subjects, the way the sessions will be formatted, and some of their interests. So my intention is basically to teach you kind of what to spot and how to approach it. The next slide will tell you kind of the key points of information, but I'd encourage you to, as an activity, just read over this case study and make your own initial assessment of what the key information is. The importance of a student profile is it is your very first impression of the student. It's normally being curated by us to give that impression, or at least by the parents and the view of their of the tutee's learning needs. So this will be your very first impression. It'll give you an idea of their learning profile. That being said, obviously the key thing is for you to make your own assessments. This is not gospel. You might find that the student, when you get to know them, opens up and there are very different kind of needs, or a very different learning profile that you might establish through your own practice. So this is, it's essential to know how to read a student profile, but it only really will formulate those first few weeks of planning your sessions. That being said, it has a lot of key information, and it also has a lot of maybe key information that you might not have ascertained from without having to ask the student on the day. So you really want to be reading this in advance to make sure that you know kind of what exam board they might be doing, what kind of topics might be coming up. Some of them can be more vague than others, and that's why when you go to your session 0, you might have further questions. The key when I get a student profile is I try and I highlight the key details. I also highlight the action points. So, for example, what school they're at, I might research what the topics are if they're not listed because they're usually going to be on the school website. I might look at getting some kind of early resources together. If you've had a student before that really struggles with structuring, and you've got a student profile in front of you for a student that struggles with structuring, you can use those same resources, being kind of recycling your resources can be really helpful, and that student profile can immediately give you some ideas of what might work. It's always good to cast a kind of broader net at first, so relying on past experience and past resources means that you can kind of narrow down what works for each student as you go. You should never kind of go completely from the ground up. And like I said, also looking at key gaps. So anything that you might need to ask about in your session 0, in your kind of icebreaker phone call, as we sometimes call it. So what I'd encourage you to do is take a moment to read the case study for Morgan here. He starts in September of year 10, and make your kind of first highlighting. And then on the next slide, I will walk through what I saw. Okay, so this is what I have highlighted for Morgan. Firstly, he's a year 10 student, so he's at the very beginning of his GCSEs. That means that, he is going to be dealing with new and unfamiliar content. some of it will have been kind of nascently introduced in year 9, especially, for English or history, kind of key texts, or maybe the first like exam paper topics might have been introduced, but a lot of this is going to be new. That should inform the way you're approaching things. You should be doing less kind of assumptions. You might want to do some more foundational teaching. I've highlighted Bristol School because, of course, as I said in the previous slide, these school can be informative of the way that things are taught, the way that the year is planned. Some students might not have an idea of what topic is going to come in what order, so you need to do your own research, and sometimes that involves contacting the teachers as well, so that's really helpful. I didn't highlight this, but it is worth noting that some of the stuff here is coming from his parents. Parents are a really reliable and useful source of information, but they are not always a completely objective assessor of what a student needs. Sometimes that might be relevant. In this one, I didn't think it was necessary to highlight because this is all fairly standard stuff, but sometimes it's just worth noting that parents can maybe have a different perspective of what a student's priorities might be than the student themselves or the teachers themselves. I've got here that we need to focus on pandemic teaching. That can mean a lot of things. Pandemic teaching often forced students to do a lot of independent work. So you might want to focus more on guided work. It might be that they were neglected in terms of things like dialogue. If they're being sent weekly worksheets, for example, that is very much just kind of focusing on assessing their subject knowledge, assessing maybe a bit of exam skills. So taking more of a dialogue approach might build those key kind of skills that for an essay subject would build in, like developing an argument. So generally speaking, that is one of the kind of a key distinction, is if you're dealing with a student that struggled from pandemic teaching, or other things like maybe they missed school because of illness or something like that. Like you should adapt to the gaps that might have come up in the form rather than the substance of their teaching as well. Just always worth looking at his predicted grades, mostly 5s and 6 at the end of year 9, so that means there is room for improvement. It doesn't say here notably what he wants to be getting, so establishing that goal is going to be really important, but noting he's not starting from a weak foundation. A 5 and a 6 is not bad, but there is a 4 in maths, so perhaps maths is more of a priority. It definitely seems to be more of a priority if the parents felt the need to kind of place it on there. Obviously this is about essay subjects, so we're not really going to be dealing with the math sides today, but you will often be in a situation where you may be asked, or you may be applying for tutees who have mixed between essay subjects and kind of STEM subjects. So knowing that split is important. Morgan doesn't feel very confident in sitting exams. So confidence is obviously one of those key skills that is kind of holistic and also very nebulous to pin down. You might need to establish what is it in an exam that is the issue. Is it just the idea of it? Going back to that pandemic teaching, some schools have you sitting from SATs all the way up to every year end of year exams. You're doing kind of exams in exam schools at some in exam halls at some schools. So it could be the case that it's just been his first exam. It might be the case that this is a consistent thing. Figuring out why. Is it timing? Is it structuring? Is it just knowing how to answer a question? All of these things are kind of, now you've got the seed of an idea of where to direct your kind of initial assessment and finding those gaps. But again, we see his parents think that the reason is that he does not revise properly for subjects he's not interested in. This is a very common situation. If a student doesn't engage with something, then getting them to sit down and work on it independently might not work. This might suggest you need to be a bit more kind of guiding. It might mean you need to build some revision techniques in. All of these things are for you to make an assessment of. But that student profile might be a kind of that first sign of maybe we need to do some flashcard exercises, maybe some homework on building some revision resources. It's all kind of in that ballpark of figuring out where we're going in those first sessions. And then we can see he's going to be receiving maths and English tutoring. So obviously you'd be if you're doing this, hopefully focusing more on the English side or maybe both, but it's alternating fortnightly for 1 hour per week. So it's important to note on that front, just the structure might change. Maths and English every other week is not a lot. That means you're going to be covering, 2 sessions on each per month. Or if you were just doing English, you'd just be doing 2 sessions a month of English. So think, taking that into account with your timeline, the gaps between sessions might inform that you need to do some more consolidation kind of starters between each sessions. It might also mean that later on you might have to have that kind of conversation with the parents if you think that it's not enough. And especially as you get towards exams, it's always important to be talking about, is this enough, and setting those expectations. And lastly, we've got some interests, football, running, and programming. Programming is kind of interesting in the maths side, but also, students that are sporty, that are active, you can find ways of bringing things into their interests. If it's English, do some English language work on maybe writing a report on a sport, maybe writing it on Liverpool as he supports Liverpool. There are always ways to blend interests in, and especially in those first few weeks where you don't want tutoring to feel like a chore, this is the way to really kind of bridge those gaps. This student is starting in September of year 10. They will not be sitting their exams for about 18, 19 months. So you have the benefit of, you don't have to prioritize, we're going to do past papers from session 1. You take advantage of that and build in this kind of key idea of making the session fun, blending it with their interests, kind of parceling those skills, maybe those assessment objectives like knowledge, analysis and evaluation, parceling them in with key interests. And of course, apart from the student profile, one of your other kind of pre-first session ways to gain information about the student for your planning is the session 0. So this is usually our 15 to 30 minute icebreaker phone call. You want to be introducing yourself. You want to be kind of, if the student is there, which normally they are for secondary subjects, you want to be talking to them as well, kind of getting an idea, just making things easier. Sometimes you might do it on Zoom. It doesn't always have to be on the phone. Sometimes it might even be in person, depending on the student. The main thing is that you are focusing on kind of talking about your initial impressions. Maybe they're going to fill some gaps. Maybe something didn't translate properly, and also setting those expectations of what you can be doing, how you're planning on helping, introducing your pedagogy. Like someone that I personally believe in feedback driven tutoring, I always say from the very beginning, like, what you can expect from me is I will build in any feedback that you have into restructuring and replanning our sessions. So setting that expectation from the beginning can be a really key tool for kind of evaluating your sessions. At this point, you should also have a rough idea of what the first few weeks of tutoring will look like, just based on that student profile. I would encourage you to maybe say, so the first session is going to be just a bit of an assessment, a bit of getting to know each other, kind of building from there, what subjects are you going to cover, what topics do you think might be important. Just have a rough idea, kind of, if the student is, say, with the case study before, if the student is struggling with maybe revision, maybe you will do some revision booster. If the student is struggling with planning, maybe the first thing to do is just get some planning in there. You have to have a bit of an idea of guiding it, because the parents and the tutee will be looking to you for, well, what are we actually going to be doing in these first few weeks? But you do not have to have a full lesson plan at this point, because you can find out a lot of information from that kind of icebreaker call, the session 0. Importantly, before the session 0, you should have a list of any of the gaps from the student profile, any of your action points, anything in your research that you need filling in with. If there's syllabus questions that you need filling in with, this is one of the key places to get that information. Ask questions early on, because you don't want to be asking what exam board are we doing like 8 weeks into teaching someone. Obviously this is less true for English or history or any other subject than it is for maths, but you still get these situations where people don't really kind of ask the right questions early on, and then they end up realizing maybe they've taught the wrong content or they've not been hitting the right assessment objectives. So come prepared with questions. This is just as much for you as it is for the tutee. and you should use it in that way as a kind of resource gathering exercise and an information gathering exercise. And also try and establish the structure of the lessons. Will the student need homework? Will the student need a break in the sessions? Do the students want to increase the frequency, or even more like kind of housekeeping exercises, like will there be sessions over the holidays? All of this should be established early on. It's part of building expectations, and it is one of the most essential things for kind of holding in that kind of accountability as well. If you agree to do homework every week, then make sure you're setting homework every week. This is a kind of key part in building that relationship and showing yourself as a kind of professional who has thought about these things, who has a kind of an idea, I guess, of the direction they want to be taking it. But because tutoring is a dynamic and kind of feedback driven process, also you're not just driving it forward on your own. You're asking questions, you're establishing the structure together. I often talk about the tripartite approach. There are three parties, sometimes four if you count the school, but there are three parties really. It's you, the tutee, and the parents, and you're all going to be involved in very different ways in this process. So talking about that is important. And lastly, at the end of that icebreaker session, I always try and set a short-term and a long-term goal. Maybe the short-term is, right, you're struggling with Macbeth. Then we are going to do Macbeth for the first learning cycle for the first few weeks. Long-term goal, you're not confident with time management? Great. Well, my goal is to get you to that level of confidence. Have an agreement, have something that you can be held accountable on, and have something that you can actually measure your progress on. That's one of the key skills, and that's one of the best ways to use a session zero. So yeah. Okay, so we are now looking at making a first assessment. So the initial assessment stage is one of these necessary parts of any tutoring. Even if the student isn't doing exam subjects, maybe they're a year 8 that needs help with English, maybe like they're miles away from sitting an exam, you still want to be assessing where they're at, because all progress will be linear. Everything will be going from point A to point B, regardless of whether point B is getting them, a grade 9 in an exam, or whether it's something more nebulous, like helping them to feel a bit more confident with their creative writing. You are always going to be going forward, hopefully, so you need to know, where are you working from? You need to establish a benchmark. So how do we structure our initial assessment stage, making these first assessments? Well, the first thing is use the information available. You don't need to double up or double down on the information provided. If they've recently done an end of year exam, that's got enough information for you. Maybe you can get a copy of it for you to read over, but you still need to make your own judgment. If you know that they're struggling with something, find out how far they're struggling with something. But if you know they're really confident with something, maybe you assess it further down the line, but right now it's not your priority. Make your own judgments on what's important, but use the information available. Also ask for resources outside the session. This goes back to the tripartite approach. Ask the student for examples of past writing, or set, after that first session, set an assessed homework and get an example of like how they're approaching the exam. Even if it's something just like getting them to plan an essay, or getting them to produce, like a fact file on a subject that they might be less confident on, to test where their knowledge is at. This can all be an assessment of where the student is at. Remember, assessment for most essay subjects hits the assessment objectives of knowledge, which is the kind of the substantive content, the facts, the basic recall, analysis, responding to a context, whether it's a source question or an extract, and evaluation, forming a critical argument. So build that in, make a judgment on each of those 3 assessment objectives. Obviously tailor it to the syllabus as well, but also exam skills. This could be things like timing, method, or kind of how they plan things. There is no one set assessment method though. Find one that works for you. It is really hard to quantify things on like a percentage level, especially if you're not experienced with marking, for a kind of qualitative subject like English or history or even business studies and economics. Going up to A level, it gets a bit trickier to pull these things out. had, for example, philosophy students before and sociology students before, who, when they're on those early stages, they don't really have a clear idea of what the exam is. So getting them to just sit a past paper might not be the best way of doing that assessment style. Mix your method, and also mix your kind of the benchmark you're setting, but try and quantify everything you can, even if it's just you're scoring them on a grade of, below average, average, above average, or 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. Quantify things. The reason is this holds you accountable to yourself. It gives the tutee a track of progress, and it shows the parents what's going on, because they might be reading your session reports and get a rough idea of where the progress is, but having something on paper that you can show them and you can review with them will be able to show them a much more kind of easy way of how progress is made, because they might not understand the importance of writing an intermediate conclusion when you write it, when you say, well done to this student for really cracking that in a session report, but they will understand, oh, well, my student has moved from a 6 out of 10 to a 7 out of 10 on the planning metric that the tutor set for them. And yeah, going back to using mixed methods, that's just, again, like, that's not just an assessment method of like going on the quantitative level of 1 to 10 versus going on there's the 3+1 style or something like that. It's the actual way of doing it, whether it's doing assessed homeworks, whether it's doing past papers, whether it's building fact files, whether it's doing dialogues, having conversations. Use everything, because students will have spiky profiles. I've had students before that really struggled to get their thoughts on paper, really struggled to know how to answer a question, but when I've had a dialogue with them, when I've chatted about things, they can articulate their ideas perfectly. So that's why we use mixed methods, because you might actually find that there's a real kind of key to this student's learning style that might not have been explored in class, because it's hard to quantify something like that through an end of year exam. A few tips. It doesn't have to be a lengthy process. Your initial assessment can be just 1 or 2 sessions. Maybe it needs to be longer if you're covering lots of things with a student. But this is important because, firstly, you can access knowledge on a topic by topic basis. So you don't need to know how a student is going to respond to a Streetcar Named Desire or something like that, or Romeo and Juliet. You don't need to know where they're at on that yet if you're not going to be covering that for a few months. Set that aside. If you're going to be doing Macbeth next week, you want to know where they're at with Macbeth. If likewise, you should always be assessing. Assessment is a process that is going on throughout. That quantitative kind of model that you build for assessing your student, you should be updating regularly to show their process. So even though this might be where the front heavy kind of building a benchmark is, or building a quantitative structure is, you still ought to be assessing throughout. So don't worry about doing it all at the beginning. Focus on those key assessment objectives. That is what they're going to be marked at the end of the day. We are in education preparing them for an exam. Even if it's building confidence, it's still building confidence around answering the assessment objectives. So focus on those. And this is your benchmark for measuring your own success. So use it that way. Review your plan in the light of this kind of assessment. Review whether you do need to change things around. And depending on where the student is during their timeline, like I said, start introducing those exam skills as well. It might not be necessary straight away now. But yeah, that is making a first assessment. So we've now spoken about kind of how to form those early ideas of what your structure for your lesson planning is going to look like. But how do we actually plan lessons? How do we actually pull it all together? Well, the key thing that I use is learning cycles. Learning cycles are a really valuable way of actually tying together all of this information you've got and targeting those assessment objectives and targeting those exam skills. They are a multi-week approach to sessions. It's different from just saying this session we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and having everything segregated and separate. It's like you set a multi-week objective, you couple it with a key topic, and you work towards that. This means that you can split the length of it however long you need it. This gives you, we have plenty of resources on the Greenhouse website for actually putting this all on paper, but you need to be the one deciding, making these judgment calls, using your discretion of what you're going to be focusing on. we've spoken now about how to prioritize things to focus on, topics to focus on, and skills to focus on. But how do we put it all together? I use learning cycles. Essay subjects will include topics that tackle multiple themes and multiple assessment objectives. Using evaluation will be important throughout all of economics A level, but you will not be using macro skills in micro, you won't be using micro skills in macro. You need to learn to split these things. So the trick is you need to couple things up. It is a way to likewise improve multiple key skills at once and teach synthesis of exam technique. The student isn't going to be assessed one by one on knowledge, then analysis, then evaluation. They're not going to be, just doing an essay where they're really focusing on getting it done in the shortest amount of time, and just doing one where they build a perfect plan and then execute that perfect plan. Everything is going to be tied together. So it would be anathema to that idea if we were to teach students everything individually. A learning cycle, setting a blended objective, means that you can show the student how this all comes together, how this all synthesizes. You build it from the ground up sometimes, as you'll see in the example here, until eventually you've gotten them from point A to point B, from that to this is what our objective is, to here's how we've got there. And that will build their confidence, that will give them an understanding of how to actually sit the exam, how to actually meet their objectives. And importantly, it's worth noting a learning cycle is a very malleable tool. Use it however you want. You might set a learning cycle that is just 2 sessions long. I often, for students that might be doing multiple subjects with me, I might have multiple learning cycles going on at the same time. I might be, say, if I've got a student, for example, going back to economics, we might be doing 2 sessions a week. I might be doing one macro and one micro. So I might have learning cycle 1 and learning cycle 2 going on, then learning cycle 3 and learning cycle 4 going on. The point is that the teaching within these learning cycles on a session by session basis is still working towards this goal. The length can be variable. The format can be variable, the goals can be a variable. Importantly though, have them planned in advance, because if you have a rough idea, I always say that you should be about 8 weeks in advance. 4 weeks is the bare minimum. But if you can have, and let's say we have 4 sessions in a learning cycle, that's 2 learning cycles ahead. But having them planned in advance makes them interchangeable. When we get onto adaptability later on, I will explain why you need to be able to slot kind of subjects in and out as they come. Having at least a pre-baked or half-baked even idea of what's going to come next will help you just to get some stuff together and really get your, get your own resources and your own maybe idea of the subject in line for when a student is about to maybe throw a curveball at you and say that they need to focus on something else now. So always have it ready to slot out. Ideally, you should, when you start a learning cycle, you should finish it because you've set a goal and you know that you've succeeded when the student can complete that goal. But obviously that means that isn't always the case, and don't be afraid to reevaluate the learning cycle as you're going. Sometimes you need to extend it as well. Sometimes you need to shorten it. Sometimes you might need to change that objective or split it over multiple learning cycles. It's a very adaptable tool. It's more for your own accountability, and it gives the student a good idea as well of the roadmap of what you're going to be taking in a session. When I start a new learning cycle, I tell my tutee, like, this is what we're going to be doing. This is the learning cycle we're focusing on. This is our learning objective, and here's how we're going to get there. Gives them a roadmap. It helps them to feel a bit more confident than me saying in 4 weeks' time you're going to sit in a past paper question and we're going to see how far you can get with that. So I've given an example. Learning cycle 2. After completing your initial assessment with Morgan and getting to know him first as a student, you decide Macbeth should be the key topic to focus on first. So I set a learning objective. We're going to refresh his knowledge of Macbeth. Let's say he did it in end of term in year 9, and we're going to then complete one past paper question. Going back to that case study, struggled with exam confidence. Well, let's show him that he can do it. The first session, I'm reintroducing the text. I'm going for that broad kind of cover of the content. I'm going to be giving the kind of the key facts, kind of maybe doing some guided reading. We're going to be going over that. We're going to be focusing on that knowledge, that K skill. we're maybe also going to be kind of blending it with some of our exam skills. Maybe we'll do some kind of quick fire questions, some timed exercises. Maybe if we can, we'll do maybe less planning, because that's not really relevant at this point, but maybe we'll start to nascently introduce forming a little argument or having a debate of what's your initial impression on this character or something like that. And maybe we're going to be looking at, well, how do we start to couple together this knowledge? If I've taught context and I've taught the text, how do we tie it together? You can go about it in various ways. This is a really, at the surface level, this is the very first thing you do. You should then, on a session by session basis, be fleshing this out, putting what homework you're going to set, putting what exercises you're going to do, what specific assessment objectives you're going to do. But you should, at the very minimum, have an idea, be able to summarize in one sentence or less than a sentence in what you're going to be doing in each session. In session 2, you can see we're doing key themes. That's your analysis. That's kind of looking at the broader overview of the text, tying it together with knowledge. Maybe that's where we do a bit of more planning, maybe a bit more kind of building developed arguments in. And session 3 is planning and structuring an answer. At this point, Morgan should be feeling confident enough to hit an exam question, because we're going to teach him how to plan it. We're going to build a really developed plan together for him to execute his homework, and hopefully at the end of it, we'll be hitting that evaluation kind of skill of how to build an argument, how to answer the question, and he'll know that we've already covered the knowledge, we've already covered the analysis, and now we just need to tie it all together. So it builds a really clear roadmap for yourself and for the student on how to get there, and you've got a benchmark at the end. Complete one past paper question. It doesn't say to a specific grade level, but that's one way of you knowing how far they've gotten, and it's one way of them knowing that they can at least complete the past paper question. They've got the tools in their toolbox. Now it's just about refining them in future learning cycles. So yeah, that's learning cycles. Okay, so now we are looking at our first key tutor skill. This is synthesizing content with exam skills. Exam skills are as valuable to many students, especially when it comes to confidence, as the actual fluency with the content itself. In school, this is often neglected, it is often separated from substantive content. They might do timed exercises, but it won't replicate an exam. Rarely will they do enough kind of past paper practice at the early levels to make it feel less daunting. It really depends on the school, but it's something that I personally feel gets neglected a lot. Like I said, confidence in exam doesn't just come from practicing past papers. It comes from a lot of other factors. It comes from feeling like you are able to plan an essay, to answer a question, feeling like you're able to respond to a source, being not just fluent with doing past paper after past paper, but with what the assessment objectives are. All of that is a key part of sitting an exam, and that's what we should be teaching. I have broken the 3 exam skills down into method, planning, and timing. Method is knowing how to read the question, basically answering it, pull out the key information. It's knowing the assessment objectives to target. It's knowing question 3 on a history paper will be a source response, so it's going to be less kind of maybe relying on evaluating and building an argument, and more about analysing a topic. It's about mixing subject content with analysis and evaluation. It's about knowing how to actually go from saying a fact to making a case based on the facts. Planning is about organising your ideas. It's about producing a developed structure. It's building a line of argument. It's building a narrative. This is everything for a student to be a developed kind of narrator of, whether it's an academic argument, whether it's a creative story. It's all about planning. And lastly, timing. This is time management. This is intra-question timing and inter-question timing. So that's within the specific questions, much time you're spending per paragraph, and within the exam, how much time you're spending per question, as well as question prioritization, putting forward the ones that maximize marks, or putting forward the ones that the student struggles with first. All of these are skills. All of these are skills that are maybe in the meta of sitting an exam, but they're all valuable and they do affect a student's performance. these should not be treated separately, because reinforcing them throughout will see student confidence grow. I have had students that would really be able to recite to me any of the key facts from a history syllabus, but would really struggle with actually putting it on paper. I want them to feel confident with doing that, because it is about confidence. It's not about it's not about a lack of knowledge. It's not that they couldn't sit the exam in theory. It's just about being able to put those ideas down. So this is how we get them there. But one kind of warning with that is you have to be strategic. Avoid coupling weak exam skills with weak content. Know your tutee's strengths. Exam skills can be daunting. Students that have not sat exams before, especially GCSEs and A levels, they've got a very kind of built up idea of what it's going to be like. Help to dispel some of those myths. It's a very mystified idea of your GCSEs. Everyone, the pressure is parents and teachers always saying, it's all building up to this, when you need to teach them, no, it's not. We are building week on week towards something that is going to happen. But hopefully by the time you get there, you'll have done 1,000 times. Exam skills may mean that the student feels this kind of mystification of the exam. They might be able to complete a worksheet for you, they might be able to have a dialogue with you, but then when you tell them it's an exam, they might freeze. So don't couple their weak skills with their weak content. It might seem like common sense, but it's always worth reminding that if they're really struggling with a particular topic, step back. Maybe take an eye away from the exam for a moment to help them with the content. Likewise, if they're flying away with content, then make sure that they're now applying it to the exam. Synthesis is important, but it shouldn't be the whole priority, because sometimes you do have to be adaptable. Okay, and to kind of facilitate this, I have split activities into 3 areas: question, games, and dialogue. The purpose of this is to show you how you can kind of synthesize things together. I've split them before, kind of like you've got questions which are more independent. These are normally past paper questions, but they can be kind of planning exercises as well. To dialogue, which is the least independent. This is you having a conversation with them. So you can kind of see as you go left to right, it goes from most independent to least independent, and each one generally hits one of the key exam skills. Again, like, you should be synthesizing throughout, but this is just maybe a handy bridge if you're struggling to find a way to tackle an exercise that is mixing maybe knowledge with planning, or maybe mixing analysis with method or something like that, or analysis with timing. Thinking of it in these 3 areas might help you to do that. So I think one of the key things is a lot of the time you are packaging content. So a lot of the time you are maybe showing them some slides and working through the slides and guiding them through the slides to get the knowledge there, or to give them the kind of pre-packaged ideas that will form their analysis or their evaluation. That is part of tutoring. That is, it's not the whole thing. It definitely shouldn't be even the majority of it. Exercises will be the foundation, though, for building in these exam skills. You can't practice timing with them if they're just sitting listening to you explain an idea to them. You can practice it for an activity. So these are the 3 activities. Questions, they are mainly focused on that planning, that kind of how to actually, maybe a bit of method answering the question, but planning of how to structure your ideas. These are more independent. You should build worked examples. You should show them how you should structure a model answer. Start without timing, introduce formal elements first. I always say start with a rough plan, then teach them to do develop plans, then teach them to answer a full question. Try to mix topics towards the end. That means maybe rather than getting them to answer one question, answer multiple. Mix, both themes and questions that will come across multiple papers. Might be the case that they're sitting 2 papers on the same day, so there's no reason to not get them to sit an English and a history past paper back to back or something like that. It does depend with questions on the timeline. These should, towards the end, this should be your main priority when you're planning, is more past paper questions. But It really depends. So yeah, you can be planning questions, building develop plans or structures. It's not just answering questions is the important thing. You might build a paragraph. You might but you might just be building a rough plan, because that can be enough for you to see, okay, the student knows how to hit a bullet point of knowledge, hit a bullet point of analysis, hit a bullet point of evaluation. They can write me a topic sentence. They can write me an intermediate conclusion. They can do a good judgment paragraph. Games, meanwhile, these are normally timing focused, quick fire questions, maybe doing quick fire analysis, maybe doing a quick fire source response. Show them a source for 60 seconds and say, hey, what are your initial impressions? This can be very useful for new content as well. Games can make, gamifying an idea can make it a bit less daunting, because it feels, when it's a game, people feel less worried about messing up, that you're not assigning marks to it like when you're doing a question. It can help to remove some of the daunting parts of exam pressure as well. If their timing is improving session on session, and when it comes to the exam, they're used to doing things in time conditions. Games can also be tactile learning. They can hit different parts of the brain than just sitting there reading a question, answering a question. If a student is an active learner, games can be a very key method. So yeah, focus on quickfire games. Multiple choice maybe is a good way of building it in. You can hit anything. You can hit knowledge, you can hit analysis, and you can hit evaluation with games. Lastly, we have dialogue. This is especially important if you are doing those kind of sessions that maybe are, a bit packaging knowledge to the student for, maybe it's the first session of a learning cycle and you need to get content across. Well, don't just read to them, speak to them, engage with them. This can be very method focused. This can be about how are we going to respond to a question? How are we going to build an argument? It's the least independent because it involves you. Sometimes it can involve parents. That often works as well. But it encourages students to do things like teach back to you. You can ask them, okay, can you explain this concept back to me and consolidate some knowledge? And you can, in that process, see how they're thinking. You can probe them a bit more. If I set someone an essay question for homework, only, X factor can I see that they are struggling with something, and I can't remedy it in the moment. I can't dispel a myth in the moment. I can't rectify an inconsistency in the moment. I can only do that in the moment when we're having a dialogue about it. So seeing how they think is a very key skill. It also builds in confidence, it builds in confidence check-ins, or it does build in confidence as well, but it means that you can see how their confidence is, because you can ask them, how do you feel about this? You can see how they're responding to that. And you can hit AOs through questioning. You can say, can you give me a point of knowledge? Can you analyze this? Can you evaluate this idea? You can just give them, you can sprinkle this in. It doesn't have to be a specific activity. You can do it as a check-in, as a pit stop. And it also builds reciting and communication skills, which some students really need. I mean, it's very helpful for English as well. And if you're a verbal learner who maybe engages more by doing things, who engages more by speaking to people, and if you're a chatty student, then build on that, use dialogues. As I said, I've got students that can talk to me about a subject but really struggle to get it on paper. So in those first sessions, maybe I do want to encourage them to feel a bit more confident by talking about it. Some people say that you should avoid the kind of the pub chat approach, keep things academic, and I agree with that. Like, you should encourage students to speak academically and write academically, but don't at the beginning discourage them because things have to be in a certain way. If I can have a conversation about a student on a topic and they can talk to me about it, have opinions about it, then that's great. Then I'm halfway there to them actually writing an essay. I just need to kind of help them reformulate it into something that will pick up marks. So yeah, those are the 3 activity types, and that's basically the tutor skill of synthesizing subject content with exam skills. Okay, and lastly, a little note on adaptability, our last tutor skill of today. I will begin with a quote. Plans are useless, but planning is essential. Now, saying plans are useless after a lesson planning workshop might kind of sound stupid, but it's true. Planning is the part that we care about. You should build lesson plans, but you need to be prepared that as a tutor, you have to be adaptable. It's one of the most, I think, intrinsic skills to this job, because the learning process is dynamic. You are there maybe an hour a week, 2 hours a week. The student is learning for 10-fold, 20-fold that. So you will often be faced by changing tutee needs. Difficult topics might come up in class, and you need to deal with that in the moment because they're struggling with it. Homework assistance might be needed in a session. Maybe they're working on a particular essay and they really can't get their head around it. Jump in and help. Or they might want to progress onwards. They might say, actually, like, I'm feeling confident with this. You need to be adaptable to all of this. This is why being 8 weeks ahead is important. This is why knowing when to be adaptable is important. The point of planning is to be able to respond to these situations. So building a bank of resources if you need to quickly develop a learning cycle is important. If you're teaching multiple subjects, hopefully you know how to jump between them. Maybe if you're doing maths and English and they need an extra English, you can jump in and do that. Or if you've got multiple tutees, hopefully you've got resources from your sessions with them that you can throw into your sessions with the student that wants to kind of change the plan around. Having learning cycles you can slot in and being responsive is important. But know when to be firm and stick to your plan. If you think something is important, you can respectfully disagree with a student, or you can say, I appreciate what you're saying, but maybe we're going to do that next week. I'm not expecting anyone to ever build a whole lesson on the fly. That would be great if you could, but resources demand otherwise. You might not be able to entirely deliver that. You might be able to answer questions. Hopefully your fluency with the syllabus means you can vet specific questions and give most of a lesson, but you need to be prepared to say, actually, either for the need of the learning cycle and for the need of the learning cycle and for responding to that kind of learning objective you set, you need to stick to it, or for the need of just not having the resources, you need to stick with the plan. Be firm but don't be dogmatic is my advice. Don't be afraid to rewrite your lesson plans or your learning cycles. I always say this is why we look 2 learning cycles ahead, so we can flip things around, but always be reevaluating as you go as well, because sometimes a learning cycle might need to come to an end earlier. Being adaptable isn't just adapting to the demands of the tutees, the demands of the student's school, or the demands of the parents. It is also being adaptable to your own internal locus of evaluation. It's if you don't feel something is working, extend it or shorten it, move on, come back to it. You have that judgment and you have to be adaptable to your own plans. Writing something on paper is there so that it can be torn up. It is there so that you can later, at the end of the day, it's not going to be to anyone's detriment if you have to spend a bit longer replanning a lesson. It will only benefit the tutee and yourself more. So I just really encourage you to always think about being adaptable with your plans, always be reevaluating them, and always try and build that bank of resources. This goes all the way back to what I was saying at the beginning about kind of doing those initial assessments, building that initial plan. You set a short-term and a long-term goal. Ask yourself, if I change my plan now, will it be to a greater benefit of my of advancing my tutee's long-term and short-term goals? I would just advise that it is probably the most key skill to have if you're dealing particularly with a student that is in need of maybe more kind of dynamic tutoring with things like confidence as well. Like if a student is struggling, and I've had this quite a few times of students struggling in class, they will benefit more from you saying, oh, you know what, you're doing Macbeth, you're struggling with Macbeth, let's do a session on Macbeth today. Pause the learning cycle. You don't have to stop it entirely, but it might help their confidence in class. It might, make their learning experience more broadly a positive one. So that's why it is important to be adaptable in that circumstance. But as I said, more generally, you should be adaptable both to the needs of your tutee and your own kind of judgment of your own success. So yeah, that's just a little note on adaptability. Okay, so we are now at the end of this lesson planning workshop. Today we've covered student profiles and session 0. We've covered the initial assessment stage. We've covered learning cycles. We've covered synthesizing subject content with exam skills, and we have covered adaptability. hopefully this has all made sense. On the next slide, you will see my contact information. If you have any questions, if there's anything that you need a bit of clarity on or advice on, I'm always happy to respond and give some advice. I don't really have much else to add apart from just, yeah, I hope this has been helpful for planning your lessons in the future. I would encourage you to, make it your own, take what I've done and use your own experience to kind of learn from it. So that is my basic advice. Go through it. You might have noted I neglected showing you this is the right way to plan a lesson. This is the right way to put it on paper, because we've got resources on our website. We've got a kind of baked general plan of how to do it, but you can use your own methods. You can use a visual guide. The key point is that it's how you structure your pedagogy. It's how you structure your sessions. So I advise the learning cycle approach, but that is so broad you could take it in any direction you want. It's a handy idea of keeping a multi-week objective kind of oriented idea. But yeah, hopefully this has given you some tips on how to plan your lessons, what to look for, and kind of the key skills you need when you're directing your lessons forward. Thank you for listening.